Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. We are excited to finally get going into the story of Joseph. Chapters 37 through 50, of course, is a rather lengthy narrative of one character that is a delightful story. In one sense, we're kind of normalizing our narrative away from those odd moments of Genesis 3, talking snakes, and divine beings coming down in 6 and the Tower of Babel and things like that. Now we're getting into a narrative that could be made into a modern day movie, and it has, and we'll enjoy it from there. So we're going to do 37, 38, and 39 today. That's my goal. Welcome, Mike. What I'd like to do is begin with this question, and really it introduces this story, and that is, how do you read a narrative that otherwise sounds so normal with a divine counsel worldview attached? Does it put it the other way around? Does a divine counsel worldview change the way we read the Joseph narrative, if at all? And I have 6 ideas that I'll throw at you, Mike, and see what you think of them. Number 1, we still read, and this is big to a divine counsel worldview, and that is you read the text left to right. So you're going to be asking the original meaning of stories here, or what Joseph or Jacob or his brothers thought. And, that's how we're going to read this still and apply it to our life as it were later. And that's not our intention here then. We're trying to understand the story from its original reader and audience. Number 2, if gods are real, then we are still asking, even in a normal narrative like this, which Elohim are we talking about? In other words, it's going to be still on our mind, especially as we now get into a boy who's 17 getting sold into Egypt. And that brings up my 3rd point. If we follow through on a DCW, Egypt as a land, as a political entity, and as a territory has been allotted to a created Elohim. So when we'll hear at the end of 36, or it's 37 verse 36, that Joseph was, quote, sold to Egypt, there will be a theological punch that we're supposed to take here. And we're supposed to say, oh boy. Now we have to wonder, will Yahweh even be active in this boy's life if he's being sold into a land that has been allotted to the power or authority of a created Elohim? So to me, that's where a divine counsel worldview will be very alive and active, because of, again, we're changing boundaries in this story. That brings me to number 4. Consistent with what has been promised, Yahweh will be found to be a portable patron deity. And he can even be, and this is 4 times, not incidental, 39, 2, 3, 21, and 23, the 4 verses in chapter 39, where it says that Yahweh was, quote, with Joseph. I think that's trying to say, in answering the question, will Yahweh be active in a foreign territory? You better believe it. He was with Joseph. And so Joseph was able to, as it were, take Yahweh with him into a foreign territory. And the story progresses based on that kind of thing, that Yahweh is very active with this young man because he was a Yahwist. Number 5, I'll give you 2 more, Mike, and then be happy to hear your thoughts here. Watch how Yahweh is used in the Egyptian narrative, the word Yahweh, put in there, of course, by the editor later when he knows the name of Israel's deity. It's actually going to be missing. If you look in your concordance for the word or the name Yahweh, it's, again, very common in our story. It's been put there by the editor, I believe. But it's going to be missing between 39:23 and 49:18, almost the entire Joseph narrative. Once he gets involved with bringing his brothers into town and that sort of thing, the name Yahweh is missing. It might have some reasons outside of theology for that. It might be because the story was to be told among the Egyptians afterwards, and therefore the name Yahweh may not have been used or something like that. But the point is that there will be times, like in 43:23, it's key, shall we say, that Yahweh as a name, again, whatever name they would have used in place of it, is missing. It's as though Joseph is trying to keep his brothers unaware of his own identity, and he does it by not referring to his own God's name, or again, whatever name they would have used. So to me, that's interesting, is how the name Yahweh even appears in the narrative, even in its final form. And then the last question, and I think it's a fair one that, again, my commentators, I could not find any discussion on this. And even when I asked ChatGPT what he thought or it thought, you could tell I've always been amazed at Chat's ability to think theologically, as it were, and give me some interesting ideas. Here's one that it struggled with, I would say, and that is, were the 11 brothers of Joseph Yahwists? I think it's a fair question to put it out front, that at least keep this in our mind. Is their father's choice of Yahweh, Jacob, does that filter into the life of Reuben, Gad, Issachar, Naphtali, these boys? Because, I'm going to presume everyone knows the story of Joseph as we get into this, but remember, they're going to keep their Yahwist father in the dark for 22 years about their brother. And there will be many conversations around the dinner table, I'm sure, of where Joseph is and whether he's dead. And the brothers will just whistle and say, well, I don't know. We found his coat. It was all dirty with his own blood. In other words, they're going to lie to their father's face directly for 22 years. And I'm not saying that Yahwists can't have bad behavior, but I'm saying that there's enough dark storyline going on here for those 11 boys that I think it's fair to back up and ask, okay, if we've already met a Ishmael, we've already met an Esau, that are part of the family, but they don't show any worship of Yahweh, could it said of these boys? And so I'm going to recommend as we go to watch for that. And I'm not happy to say it's not happening that they're worshiping Yahweh, but there will be some evidence that they really struggle with their worship of Yahweh. So this being all the case, then those 6 points, I'm going to be reading the whole Joseph narrative, highlighting portions. I'm not going to read it all, of course. I'm going to highlight it, but watching for how the DCW makes a difference. A lot there, but anything you want to talk about, Mike?
I think, Joseph being not just an exception, but he was exceptional. I think in comparison to the remaining brothers, I think for them, they're going to be reflecting. I don't know if we can say if they were not Yahwists, but I would probably be closer and comfortable with saying that they struggled or they emulated their dad's earlier journey, and maybe even, but maybe not even as purposeful or as desperately needed to actually figure out, what do I do with my family's God, Yahweh?
Yeah. Right.
Because when Jacob was out all by himself after the whole debacle between him and Esau, in some sense, he really needed Yahweh of like, I'm out on my own. I'm not with my dad anymore. I'm not with my mom. There was a pressing need that pushed him towards really wrestling or dealing with the question of who is Yahweh for me. But these 11 brothers, it seems to wane, come and go. We do get an interesting chapter where we take some time to look at Judah. And seems like Judah had made some progress along those years in between seeing Joseph last and then later seeing him, basically being the governor of all of Egypt. I think that it's more a telling that maybe they are reflecting in many ways a journey of what their father Jacob had gone through, but not as purposeful, not as driven. But I would say it's going to be an interesting journey just to look through how do they react and how they comprehend Yahweh at all.
Yeah. Fair enough. I'm always imagining that in heaven right now, Issachar is listening to this saying, "Oh, Ron, you got me. You blew it." And I want to pause long enough to apologize if that's where I'm going, but or I should. But let's at least watch the story with the DCW mindset of which deity are these boys worshiping. 37:1. Now Jacob dwelt in the land of where his father was a stranger, still sojourning, still a refugee. I'm always reminded of Deuteronomy 26, verse 5, in the story of how to, tell or to come to the priest with an offering. What do you say? The opening line is, my father was a wandering Aramean. That the story of Israel starts with being refugees in a foreign land. Verse 2, this is the genealogy, the Toledot, the story of, and you're expecting to hear the word Joseph, because that's where 37 is going to go. But this is actually the story of Jacob, his dad, because behind the scenes of the Joseph story is a grieving father who then will, on the other end, back in, it'll be 48 and 49, you're going to hear the words of Jacob quite a bit. So this is really the story of Jacob. And here's how it starts. Joseph, being 17, so we're picking up the story now, the year is 1898. So we're still 450 years before the Exodus. So we're a long ways away from the big event in Israelite history. We're still in that part of the story, called the patriarchs, well before it gets into a nation. Right now we just have a family. He was feeding the flock with his brothers. They're still herding and renting land. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. I don't choose to read into that. Again, a lot of people, the stories I've heard or the sermons I've heard on the Joseph narrative often try to moralize him. And, we're trying to apply it to our life kind of a thing. And maybe he sinned here by bringing a bad report. The text is hardly ever going to moralize Joseph's actions. And that's why I think, again, we're not asking those questions in a DCW read of the Bible, we often, I think, can just say that's not the point of the narrator. He happens to see something bad. He tells his dad. And then the comment made in verse 3, Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. The firstborn of Rachel. Also, he made him a tunic of, and versions have different, ways of saying this. The Old King James, many colors. I think other ones have things like a coat of long sleeves. The point is, this is the primogeniture idea of giving one son double inheritance, and thus he will be the head of the family or the clan once the father dies. So he was Jacob was planning to pass the head of the tribal leadership onto Joseph someday when he passed away. And of course, that comes with a lot of responsibility. You're in charge of marriages. You're in charge of the economy of your clan. You're making contracts with other people, so forth and so on. So it's a very powerful role. And of course, verse 4, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his other brothers, they hated him, could not speak peaceably to him. So the story just sets out to say, we've got a normal life here where a 17-year-old boy is being chosen by the dad to be the future leader of the clan. It sets his 11 brothers against him. And we take it that Benjamin is, Benjamin's always kind of on the side here, but he was, they were probably good, close friends, Joseph and him, based on how the story's going to go.
Ron,
but I'm including him in. So anything you want to add so far?
Yeah, I remember we talked about this way, way back when we were at Genesis 3. And a lot of this was because of just some of the research one of my professors had brought up when she studied about, the opening of the mouth ceremony and how Adam and his wife, there was a reflection, there are callbacks to it. And it's interesting, the word that's associated with Joseph, with his coat or robe of many colors, it's the same word that's used in Genesis 3:21, where Yahweh Elohim made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Mm. And later on, when you do a word search of this particular word, it's translated as shirt like tunic, but it's primarily associated outside of Genesis. It's primarily associated with the high priest.
Oh, okay.
And so I remember Dr. McDowell made this interesting connection that it seems to be that the garments that God made it's at least a callback or a look forward towards the idea of, humanity was originally supposed to be the very priests of Yahweh. And if Eden was like a cosmic temple, that these clothes that he made in the aftermath of their disobedience was still a reflection of that. And so there's something very interesting that here that same word is being used and applied to Joseph, that Jacob made this type of shirt that would later be associated back to the priesthood, to especially to the high priest. So there is some significance to this word because it's not a commonly used word for shirt. It's a very special word that's used in association with priesthood.
Cool. Great. Thank you. Verses 5 through 11 then tell of two dreams that Joseph has, one of them with the sheaves, and then the second one with the sun, moon, and stars. Both of them, of course, end with this picture of superiority that Joseph would have over his brothers. The second dream, even from a divine point of view, possibly would be telegraphed because sun, moon, and stars often, we think of the host of heaven idea. Could it be that even from a divine point of view, Joseph was getting information or being told through a dream that other gods would worship him, or his God would, be in charge of the heavens, as it were? That kind of thing is, at least in my mind, when I hear about the sun, moon, and stars bowing down to me. So the father in verse 11, interestingly, kept it in mind, or kept the matter as though to say, well, it makes sense to me, I guess, that I have put him in that position of leadership, and someday my other 11 boys will bow to him. So that sets up the story, of course, verses 12 through, the end of the chapter. And again, I'm just going to summarize it for those of you who know it. It's easy to read. It's here's the quick review. The brothers plan to kill him. They see him coming. Judah and Reuben plan to punish him. They don't want to kill him. They're, the first and fourth born, or this, is it Reuben? Yeah, he's the firstborn, and then Judah, the fourth born. So older brothers kind of try to temper the plan and say, well, guys, let's not kill him. Reuben actually seems to want to bring him home, so he wants to hide him in a pit. Judah wants to, and I don't know if this is any better, but he wants to sell him. So the final result is that he is sold, and I'm really hurrying through the story, but I think that's okay. He's sold to the Midianites, or the Ishmaelites. There we go again with that family name that's turned into a tribal, enemy of Israel kind of a feel. He's sold to the Ishmaelites, presumably to die as a slave. When he's sent off, and the last words that are ringing in Joseph's ears are, it would be verse 27, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites." I can't help but think that the stinging words of Judah in the hearing of Joseph will be that my brother never intended to see me again, if not just to die in slavery. So it's very important, of course, that the unknown element of verse 36, the last verse of chapter 37, is said, "Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard." So unbeknownst, and this is how these dramatic reversal stories work in famous Greek writing, for example, is that you're told something as a narrator, or the narrator tells the reader something that the characters in the play or the narrative don't know. And it's important that they don't know verse 36. He ends up in Egypt. And as far as the 11 boys knew, as they head back home, and they have killed a goat, spread the blood on Joseph's tunic, and taking it back to their father, they have said, "We have found this. Do you know?" This is just terrible. "Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?" Verse 32. And of course, for 22 years, when you add it all up, they're going to live with this lie as a family. And it doesn't speak well, again, of their morals at all. And I'm not saying, again, that has to deal in their worship patterns, but it often can. So anything else out of 37? I know I finished it fast, but it's a very well-constructed narrative that has all the ins and outs of a great story. So I'm ready to drop into 38 when you are, Mike.
I think it's significant that, you brought the reminder of how many years will pass, right? And, yes, their morals are pretty bad, but then there's a flip side to that realization, is that for 22 years, they are keeping this secret essentially within themselves as it eats away at them. Not only will they eventually have to deal with the ramifications of their father, one day discovering this and then reviewing what the 22 years was like, but that for themselves, they are going to be carrying this. And then for Joseph himself, there is 22 years worth of reflection, of looking back at this moment. And, for often so many of us, we can look at our traumas and we can either become very just fixated, and that fixation can become an obsession, or there's a choice to do something with that trauma into something that could be positive. And so it's interesting, right? Because I think often when we read the scriptures, we lose track of time. And if we are dealing in the fact that there is actual time that is passing, there are years going through, that means you have 22 years worth of human thought and rumination that's going on for multiple groups of people here. And that by the time we get towards the end of the story, that's what we're seeing the result of, is this 22-year journey of contemplating this moment. How do I process this moment?
Yeah, well said. 38 is an interesting chapter. It's an important development in the life of Jacob. Remember, this is the genealogy of Jacob. And so these stories, and this one in particular, chapter 38, is dropped in as though the narrator says, what we got to do, guys, is tell them this story in order for us to understand the full story of Jacob. So here it is again, and I'm just going to summarize it. I won't even add verse, notations unless I need to, but here's what happens. Judah, again, he's the fourth boy. He's the last son of Leah. Judah is, in verse 1, comes to pass, and over time, this might have been quite a bit later, that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. So anyway, here's what happens. Judah left home. He marries a foreign wife with whom he has 3 boys. Their names are Onan, and Shelah. Now, by marrying a daughter of a Canaanite, again, I think that at least gives us the sense that he was following his own path and not the hope of Abraham back in, 24, when he said, don't get Isaac a wife from, Canaan. And even Isaac later says to Jacob, don't get a wife from here, 28:1. So there's at least that hint, a gentle lean toward the idea that Judah was a non-Yahwist. Anyway, he marries this Canaanite, has these children, and that starts the story. In time, so goes our story now, his firstborn, marries a woman by the name of Tamar. We're not told a lot about her. We presume she's a Canaanite. When dies without providing a child for his wife, it was the custom, again, notice how customs get in play here. This is not written in stone by God, but this is a custom of that time. It was a customary duty of Onan, the second boy, to raise up, quote, an heir to his brother. That's verse 8, through Tamar. And then Onan refuses to do this. And I think it's because in that world, again, to have a child born through Tamar, that means the child would not be his legally, thus decreasing the value of his own estate. This happens at the end of the book of Ruth, if you remember. So Onan says, I don't want to give any children to Tamar. God kills him, verse 10, because of this. It's a pure act of selfishness. And so he dies, and the narrator credits that to God's anger with Onan. And then at this point in the story, again, moving forward, Judah should have given Selah, his only living son, then, to her, Tamar. And this is in verse 11. And then Tamar realizes he's young. It's going to be a while. So she thinks this is not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to have a child through this third man. So she pretends to be a prostitute. Interesting, by the way, in verse 15, Judah will see her, and he thought she was a harlot. And the word in Hebrew for harlot is the same word for holy one, kadosh. It just means, again, unique, different, odd. You look down the road and there's a unique woman there, and here we understand it to be a prostitute. Well, Judah enlists her and pays money to her, and she becomes pregnant through Judah. I mean, this is a mess by however you read it. And so through this moral mess, the story then ends with the survival of a descendant of Judah. Think of how, wrapping around the other side. We have Judah having two boys, Perez and I forget the name of the other one, Zerah. Yeah. And through Perez, Judah's son, through his daughter-in-law, Perez becomes the eventual descendant or the heir to David and thus even the Messiah himself. So what do you do with this mess? I mean, it's given to us as though it's a necessary part of the Jacob narrative, part of his story. What's interesting is that when you get to Matthew 1, verse 3, Perez is mentioned. Tamar is even mentioned. Ruth 4 in giving the genealogy of King David, the hero of the Old Testament in many ways. It's through Perez. It's through this story too. So maybe one of the reasons to tell the story is to rehearse for the family of Israel in generations to come. How did we get Perez? Or, where is, Judah has Perez, who is the mother, and things like that. And so since they knew that would be a story to tell, even with the morality issues at hand here, it becomes a necessary part of the story in Jewish history. The only other thing I'd mention, by the way, Mike, if you want, before I let you jump in, is the use of the word righteous. At one point, Judah wants to punish this woman for having being pregnant. And then when she brings out the proof that it was him who impregnated her, he says in verse 26, she has been more tzedekah than me, than I, more righteous. In other words, we have, and I think this is important to see from a left to right read of the Bible, that the word righteousness or righteous does not have to be a legal, even theologically laden term. It can just mean proper, in the right. So I just pause to say that we can have a word like righteous be used in a very normal, non-theological way, and be ready for it to be that way in the New Testament too, that we can have the word righteousness not be so laden with the theological background that we often give to it. So otherwise, again, it's a very sad story, and so I'm ready to move on from it if you are, but that's chapter 38.
I don't know if I would characterize this as necessarily sad, Ron, though. It's, I think it's interesting, right? Because we know that overall this is about the story of Jacob. Yet it is sandwiched in between narratives about what's going on with Joseph. And so I remember reading in other research and commentaries that there seems to be a very purposeful, that something is going on here with Judah. And because it would later inform how Judah reacts when he does meet, 22 years later, he meets Joseph again. And there is something about this incident, because at the very beginning of the story, and even before it, right, that he was concerned about the money. He was concerned about, hey, why kill him when we could actually, make a little bit of a profit? Mm-hmm. And there's an irony to me in that when he goes and does his own thing and he wants to sleep with basically a prostitute, he doesn't have any money at that moment. There's this irony is he has no cash. And true. Well, what can I give you as a deposit, as a way to make sure you will pay me back? Here, take my signet ring, take my, take these other pieces of identification. And he does that, and she uses that against him to show, hey, you weren't acting righteously to me, justly to me in our society, in our customs, because you wouldn't give me the third son, right? The whole entire narrative of, there are years later, and it becomes very clear to Tamar, Judah is not going to keep his promise to her of letting her be redeemed by having the third son as a husband. And so she works out somehow I'm going to get myself to be right in the community's eyes, in society's eyes, but I'm going to do it through a very subversive way. And ironically, in the end, Judah declares, you are more righteous than me because my own behavior, my own choices was not treating you well.
Yeah. And
somehow you have actually, uprooted that and got me to actually ironically act righteously towards you. I love the fact that the narrator mentions he never came to her again, and yet she gave him 2 sons.
Yeah, and in a sense, you could say the righteousness extended to there's no illegitimate boys in the story.
No,
Judah has a legitimate child through unfortunately, his daughter-in-law, but there's no illegitimacy to go, or to be seen.
And it's interesting. Like, I know you said that you think that she might be a Canaanite, but the narrator does not even give that detail, right? And it's almost as though it's like the narrator wants to just say, let's not care about whether she was a Canaanite or not, because in the end, she acted quite justly with Judah, and it just. It's just really funny. Judah is not acting righteously at all. and yet in the end, he's the one that will declare, oh, she's more righteous. And if you know anything about Judah or about what Judah will become later in the minds of the Jewish people.
I know. That's a fun question to ask is ask your AI, machine, whatever you're using, why did Judah ascend to be the tribe through whom the Messiah ultimately comes? And it answers back, and commentators again do as well, as we don't know. I mean, Jacob clearly puts him in a place where the scepter will not depart from his tribe. That's Genesis 49. But we're not told why he says that. We're just noticing that Jacob realizes either in Judah, whether it's through his transformation through the story, or he just finds out through God's will that Judah will be the tribe through whom the Messiah ultimately comes. That just, kind of pops out at the end of the story, but we're not told the why. So, ready for 39. Interesting again, 39:1 picks up where we left off at the end of 37. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer to Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites. So 39:1 is just trying to set the stage again for where we're going. What's important is verse 2. Again, we mentioned this. Yahweh was with Joseph. That line is very unique. Yahweh was with Joseph. It's going to be repeated in verses 3, 21, and 23. Yahweh was with him. So the first thing that pops off the page as a DCW reader is, wow, Yahweh is a portable deity. We're having a boy in Egypt, but Yahweh, his God, is, quote, with him. It also, I think, and again, I'm just being gentle with this, it may mean as opposed to the other 11. Yahweh was with Joseph, ... as he was not with the other 11 boys, in the sense that, again, he can be anywhere. I'm not saying he can't be, but maybe that's kind of hinting here that Joseph is the Yahwist among the 12. So he goes to, he meets with Potiphar. Potiphar buys him. He brings success to everything Potiphar did while in Egypt, and Potiphar notices this. It's interesting that verse 3, his master saw that Yahweh was with him. Again, I don't think Potiphar knew the name of Joseph's deity. I don't think Joseph knew the name of his deity, but the editor is putting in here that there probably was a conversation between Potiphar and Joseph in the sense of, your deity is good to you, and because you're with me, he's being good to me. And again, that a DCW read on this would be very careful with that kind of language, that he's making his deity look good to an otherwise polytheistic Egyptian man at this point. So he puts him in charge of his personal affairs. And in time, and this now moves into verse 7 through 9, Potiphar's wife makes advances toward him to commit adultery, lie with me. It seems to be Joseph's own moral courage that saved the day here. There is no seventh commandment, right? That wasn't written yet. We're still 500 years away from that. So he is being obedient to his God, I would recommend, in spite of, or, without the 10 commandments ringing in his ears. It's interesting how adultery is treated in the Old Testament. Generally, it's a capital crime in Leviticus, right? When you get to Leviticus 20 and Deuteronomy 22, that an adulterous affair, both parties have to die, because in the patriarchal nature of Israelite society, there is, if you have mistaken paternity issues, if there's a child born to the wrong, as it were, father, now you're getting into just a mess again in that patriarchal society way of thinking. So beyond just the economic issues, I don't think Joseph was thinking of that, by the way. I think he was thinking in terms of social and religious dimensions of what it would be to have another man's wife, and he just knew it was wrong. And so, interesting, treachery or adultery will be treated as treachery throughout the Old Testament, even when it comes to a man's relationship to Yahweh.
Yeah.
And so when you worship another deity, it's going to be called adultery. Jeremiah 9, Malachi 3. The idea of going to another deity is like going to another spouse. So I'll leave it there, but that's, again, interesting how Joseph knows it's wrong, even though he doesn't have the 10 Commandments in front of him.
I do wonder, Ron, if this is, I think that there's definitely something going on also culturally. Like maybe there was more of a cultural, expectation of like, well, you don't do this, even though there are people who like don't care what the societal norm is, they will still do it. And yet here you have Joseph, who actually is living out this, at that moment, at that time, an unwritten, ethic or moral code there. And I do find it interesting in verse 9 where he says, because you are his wife.
Yeah.
Right. And it dives into the level of like, this man has been good to me. And because my God has been good to me, my God has also been good to Potiphar. And he trusted me to take care of his home, not his wife. There's something very sacred, as though, I have no idea if Joseph is thinking this, but I would imagine if he had even known the story about Adam and Eve, that there is something very special about the union between a husband and wife. And you don't violate that. That there's something about that is just, you don't. And so, I don't know. It's just a very interesting thing of how he calls it wickedness. He calls it a sin against God.
A great wickedness. In fact, yeah.
And there's something about it that he just knows, no. It's like, I may have been given the trust of his household, but that doesn't include the wife. I just intuitively know that.
This would be a good moment, by the way, and I think we did it back, at least we mentioned it. We had to because it was in the text, Genesis 18, the sin of Sodom was, quote, great. Here he adds the word great in front of wickedness in verse 9, as though to say, again, I don't think this is new to anybody, but sometimes we don't hear it properly from the sermons we hear. Our sin's different to God. I think every person in the Bible would have said, are you kidding me? Of course. That, in other words, the idea of sin being bad, okay, yes, but are some sins worse than others? Sometimes in the Reformed tradition that I grew up in other words, all sin is the same because it all confronts a morally perfect God. And I remember one illustration as a junior higher, again, you can't get out of your head, and that is a guy put a little, dark ink, just touched a otherwise white sheet of paper with his black pen. And he held it up, again, from where he was standing. We couldn't see it as the kids. But he said, is this a clean sheet of paper? And of course, we all said yes. And he says, oh, no, look at this. And he showed us the little dot there. And he says, to God, all sin. And again, just think of how this affects a junior high kid. To God, the smallest wickedness is terrible. And so to God, this is a dirty sheet of paper. And again, I'm coming away from that thinking, well, what possible ability do I ever have of pleasing God if he is this moral policeman that is going to be looking at everything I do, and even the smallest miss is going to be this huge blot on my register, as it were. It was very depressing. Now, again, what the preacher was trying to say was, appreciate Jesus' death for you. I didn't interpret that way. I interpreted it as, I don't have a shot at ever pleasing God at all, and that was kind of a hard, not kind of, it was a moment of my theological journey that I look back and it's almost spiritual abuse, Does the biblical narrative present some sins as worse than others? Absolutely. So I think Joseph would have seen this as a bad, terrible, what he calls great wickedness compared to other possible wickednesses. Is that making sense? I'm not trying to say God doesn't mind small sins. I'm just saying that common sense says that it would be better to punch someone than to put a knife in their back. I mean, that's just common sense. And the sixth commandment doesn't work for hitting someone. It works because if you kill them, that's big, So I just think we need to make that very clear to children when we teach them biblical stories like this, that God is we think with God on this. There's a lot of conscience-driven issues here that I think are commonsensical, and one of them is that some sins are worse than others, and that's just part of the narrative of the Bible. And I'll leave it there. But
I have contemplated it before, because I think when you ask adults, is there different levels of sin? We would say, on a very democratic kind of way, all sin is still sin, but not the ramifications, the consequences, the aftermath of one sin compared to another are the same, right? The consequences of murder will have generational consequences for the victim's family and also for the perpetrator, if they're caught, especially, versus someone that forgot to put down the toilet seat. It's like, there's a longevity to certain types of disobediences that still play out. And I think that's something that we realistically as adults, we know this intuitively. Right. We just don't know how to communicate that in a way that makes sense to the mind of a child. And often because I think I've said this before here, and I've said this in front of my church in discipleship class, that unfortunately as Protestants, I have come to the conclusion, or close to a conclusion, that we carry the emotional baggage of the reformers at times, right? The way that Martin Luther grew up in his theology, he had a very strong obsession in some sense to being pure or being completely righteous, to such a degree that eventually his overseeing priest recommended, why don't you study Galatians? Why don't you teach on the Psalms? And just teach. And as he taught, that's how he started discovering and started understanding concepts about grace and about justification that eventually moved him towards, what we would later call Reformed theology. But it is interesting. And in some sense, we try to copy the pattern of how do we make more Martin Luthers? It's we try to instill the same sense of emotional baggage, but it's not necessary.
And this is where my own teaching over the years, I look over my, the trajectory of when I came to a divine counsel worldview. I think anyone would admit who's going through this, even on our podcast together, it takes time to become consistent in that worldview. Mm-hmm. So over time, when I was teaching in Bible college, the doctrine of sin, go back 20 years, I did teach that all sins were the same, because that's how soteriology works. Everything offends God until Jesus gets in the way and he pays my sin debt and now I'm free. That storyline, what I'll call sin management, was part of my thinking, and it's really part of the Reformed view. But then when I started putting in a divine counsel worldview over time, I found myself unable to say that. I even have in my files here, I would pass, I passed this out actually. It was a 2-page little quiz. Would it be a sin to, and I have options here, take office stationery from work, 2 pens and 5 paper clips. And they had to answer yes, no, yes or no, and then why. Roll through a stop sign, yes or no. Throw a candy wrapper outside your car window. Yes or no? Slouch way down in your chair during class. Go too long between oil changes for your car. Take a shopping cart off store property. By the time you get to the bottom, and I did this purposely, number 14 was, would it be a sin to think about buying a lottery ticket while drinking a Budweiser, while eating 4 desserts, while sitting in a smoking section at a restaurant? The point being, as I watched the students do this, and I only gave them 5 minutes for all of them, they were looking at this saying, this is dumb. Johnson, this is stupid. And my point, and that was my last question, this exercise teaches me ... And I wanted them to look up from taking this and say, this is a stupid exercise. Would it be a sin to? And then we'd get into this conversation in class. Well, wait a second. That's exactly where our moral decisions are going to go. Because you're going to ask, would it be a sin to get a divorce? Would it be a sin to, and you're going to be doing this in your mature Christian journey. You're going to be dividing a lot of things between sin and not sin. And I'm giving you this illustration to show you that if you go down this path of trying to figure out if things are sinful or not, as though it's a yes, no, black or white question, it's going to be very frustrating, even when you try to mature this into, the rest of your Christian life. So my point to them was, this is not how God looks at the world. He doesn't look at you, throw a candy wrapper out the window and say, oops, there's a check mark on your sin side. You need to repent of that when you go to confession on Friday night so that you can get it off your record. See, that's how the ancient or the medieval Catholic would wait until Friday night to repent or to confess their sins to their priest, because in their mind, soteriology was based on having a clean slate. Mm-hmm. The reformers didn't challenge that. All they said was that Jesus took care of that slate. And so by the time I was done teaching Bible college, I was trying to explain, folks, we have the wrong view of soteriology if we even agree with the reformers that it's a matter of getting our sin record expunged. That's not what soteriology is. It never was. And if we want to go back to the story of Joseph, it might be a good place to do this, that we're not looking at how Joseph handles his sin. That's not how he's going to get saved. And then, of course, the point being, that's never how anyone in the Bible gets saved, by handling their sin. So I know, again, I'm throwing a lot at you there, but to me, this kind of a story gets into this discussion for the children that you tell it to. When Joseph refuses Potiphar's wife, that's a good decision. But are we trying to moralize this into, his eventual salvation will be due to the fact that he gets forgiven for other sins that he may or may not commit during the story? That's so off the beaten path to me of where the Bible's going to be going that it's worth mentioning even in a podcast like this. That's not the point of the narrative. We're trying to ask, which God is he worshiping? Was Yahweh with him or not? How does that affect him? In this case, he made a wonderful moral choice. We applaud it and we move on, but we don't make this part of his soteriology. I would say at all. This has nothing to do with it. We just had a previous story of Judah going to a prostitute. Mm-hmm. So again, we're not trying to say one goes to heaven or hell based on whether they do right or get their sins forgiven. These are two men who make good or bad choices, and we just move on from it. So any thoughts there?
I would say, that part of the challenge, and I think part of the resistance, right, to some of this is, behavior is something that feels like you can do on a checklist. You can check this and sort of it's an external proof almost. But when you and I have talked about this many times before, we even had Matthew Bates on here to talk about why the gospel, or the importance of allegiance and loyalty to Yahweh. And Mike has called it before, believing loyalty. Yet there's some interesting kind of pushback against the idea of, can an actual conscious decision of loyalty really affect the way that we live our lives? And it's almost as like, well, we have to have some sort of delineation or marker. But the difficulty I've found over the years is, how do you rush discipleship? Because if discipleship is ultimately learning what it means to be human, learning what it means to be human again, learning what it means to be a human that God had intended us to be like, then that's a learning process. It doesn't happen in an event, and it's not going to happen by forced artificial moves of behavior. It has to come from a deeper motivation of, I really am loyal to this cause, or I'm loyal to this person, or I'm loyal to whatever. That something about that orients and centers me of what I will then do, what I will say, what I will think, not because I'm told to, but because I'm trying to express allegiance and loyalty to this thing that I hold above all other things. That has to shape me. And this that we're seeing, like even when we were just talking about Jacob earlier, everything about Yahweh over time, eventually he's just convinced, this is my God. It was a question before, will he really take care of me? And now I've been convinced after these years, he has been taking care of me. He is taking care of me. He will take care of me. And so does everything about what I will do. Family, get rid of your foreign gods. That's it. We're done with this. Because if I'm dedicating myself to this Yahweh, we have to be consistent. and that wasn't someone telling him, you have to get rid of the foreign gods. He on his own, this is not right. If I'm loyal and if I'm faithful to this one God, this doesn't make any sense. So let's be consistent. And like that's more genuinely felt. And there's a progression of thought. You can see, oh, I see why that happened.
Yeah.
And I overall, yes, we can talk on long about sometimes this emotional baggage that comes, and in some sense from the bad ways of practicing or how we instill this discipleship even in children. There's over 2 years ago, we had talked about in my church the concept of fearing the Lord, and one of the most helpful things for me as I was studying the concept of the fear of the Lord was eventually hitting upon this German scholar who coined the term numinous. It was his attempt to describe what is it that we're seeing when we see people who are fearing Yahweh. But the fear, yes, there seems to be a sense of terror, but it transforms into something that almost akin to like this devotion and this adoration, this love. And so he wanted to create a term that tried to describe this progression. That yes, when you fear Yahweh at the beginning, when you're first starting to get to know him, it starts off with like a terror. You feel this fear, this fright because of how powerful and strong this God is. But something about this God moves you towards what would later be seen as reverent, desirous, adorated worship. That you love this God. You don't just fear this God. You felt fear, but now the fear is turned into love of this God. And so he was trying to describe like when the fear of Yahweh is different. And so he coined the term numinous. And that was what we see a lot of times in the wisdom literature of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's like you desire this Yahweh because I want to be wise. How do I learn to be wise? Well, you fear this God. And when you fear this God and he is in the right place in your life and heart, something about that leads to wisdom in how you live the rest of your life.
I think what Paul does, and I love how you define this, where or exemplify it as a discipleship from fear to love. What a trajectory that would be. I think what Paul's doing in the New Testament is largely, thinking ahead here, moving both autobiographically, where he was possibly as a child learning who Yahweh was through Torah, as a Pharisee, trained as a Pharisee, but then he comes to meet Jesus and I would argue love Yahweh, love God and appreciate him. And then he comes up with what I think, talk about the idea of loyalty or believing loyalty when we see the word faith. My read on Romans 14:23, when he's trying to explain to this Roman half Jew, half Gentile family how to get along, the weak and the strong and all this, and the meat offered to idols. He who doubts is condemned if he eats because he does not eat from loyalty. We have the word faith here, but let's put the word loyalty there. And then he comes up with this bromide, this truism that I think shocked, again, half the crowd at least. For whatever is not from loyalty is sin. So what he's trying to do is, I think, say, you know what, guys, here, let's do it this way. It's kind of like with your wife. How do you know what's right or wrong when it comes to your wife? Well, if it's coming out of loyalty, it's right. If it's not coming out of loyalty, it's wrong. You just know how to dig in or say something that's going to hurt her. Well, that's wrong because it's not out of loyalty. So I think a lot of people said to this statement, if it's not out of loyalty, it's sin. They would have said back, well, that's too simplistic. It doesn't work. And Paul would say, no, that's maturity. That you start treating your deity in the sense of how you would treat your spouse. If you're doing something and you don't know whether it's right or wrong, ask this question. Does a loyalist do that? And would my loyalty, my personal loyalty, lead me to do that? And I'm sure it didn't solve, what do I eat or what do I, what day do I worship and all that stuff, Sabbath, whatever. But it certainly set a standard, kind of a shock value into the early church that I think they had to work over, and we still have to work over today. What would loyalty look like? Well, that's a path between you and your deity that may take a lifetime to flesh out. So let's finish up, I guess, with the and it will lead me to begin next podcast with this question about health and wealth. Name it, claim it. Which, when I just kind of at night, late at night, page through my TV with nothing to watch, you got TV preachers that are still saying this, if not outright. You still get the sense that if you are a Christian, God will, and you can claim verses, right? And you can send me money and it'll be a seed for God's blessing on you for later and all this kind of thing. And I often watch that kind of thing saying, who believes this? I mean, how does anyone? But then I look out in the audience and there's hundreds, if not thousands of people there, plus probably watching on TV. So let's start next time with that question about how did we get here and what should we do about it? But, and we both have our stories, I'm sure, in our own families of where we were not blessed even when we were in the right. And the reason I bring it up then is because our story today ends with it, that Joseph's response to Potiphar, of course, or his wife, was right. It was the proper thing to do, but you would never know it by the results. And 39 is meant to make you feel like, what in the world? How in the world could God let this happen to a man, a boy who is doing otherwise the perfect thing, right? So the narrator, this is beautiful narration, I think, at the end of 39. He makes it look like the visible story. This is DCW 101 to me. That the visible storyline, the left to right horizontal read on the story, is that he's put in prison, 39:20. It's the low point of low points. He has offended his master's wife and thus the master, and his head's going to roll. And so that's how the story on the visible side, human to human, works. However, the invisible story, the vertical story, the DCW story, I'd call it, is verses 21 and 23. Again, repeated, Yahweh was with Joseph. So the picture is what looks like a bad end to a story of a man doing the right thing actually is exactly where Yahweh wants him. He's in prison. I'm sure it's not comfortable. And from every read of how people would have looked at the story, Joseph was a guilty man. By the way, I don't doubt, and there was one movie version of this done by Turner Broadcasting about 20 years ago now. I used to use it in class. Potiphar knew Joseph was innocent. Yeah. He felt he was stuck. This is how the movie presented it, that his wife is going on and crying, he did this and he did this. And the Potiphar character is kind of just looking off to the side like, oh yeah, this is not happening. My friend Joseph would never have done this. I know he wouldn't have, but to save face, to save your face, to save the kingdom, I'll put him in prison. But that's how the story presented it. And I've often wondered, would Potiphar have known better? Probably, based on maybe some habits of his own wife in the past. Who knows? But that's how the story's ending. But again, we are being told from a divine counsel worldview, God's on his side, thus everything is going to be fine. And so we're wondering as we turn the page into chapter 40 for next time, I wonder how God's going to get him out of this mess. And of course, we'll find that out next time. So anything you want to add before we close up?
Yeah, I was glad you brought up the point about Potiphar probably knowing. I think I've read before, and just even when you're reading the story in the earlier part, it mentions about how Potiphar really came to trust Joseph. There just seems to be this almost, because if Potiphar really believed that Joseph had done this, he would have been well within his right to have executed Joseph right at that moment.
Right.
Well, why wait? Like, why get him be thrown in prison? Why have him arrested? Unless it really is like, well, I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. My wife is claiming this. She has his robe. I can't unprove that. But at the same time, I know Joseph's character and I know the God that he fears. And so these two don't jive, but I have no choice. I don't want to kill him though. And so what's the compromise? Prison. But at least Joseph keeps his head. Yeah. Beautiful story. Alrighty. Well, thank you, everyone. Again, joy to talk to you, Mike, and we'll talk to everyone next time. See what happens to Joseph. I'm on pins and needles to see what God can do. Is God ever stuck? Does he ever find himself in a situation where he can't get out of it? Absolutely not. So let's see what happens. Talk to you next time.